While Donald Trump was busy threatening to slap 25% tariffs on 8 European countries, sending bizarre text messages to the Prime Minister of Norway blaming his Nobel Peace Prize snub for his Greenland obsession, and literally snatching the president of Venezuela off his own soil, Xi Jinping was doing something far more calculated. He was rolling out the red carpet in Beijing for a parade of Western leaders who, just a few years ago, would not have been caught dead shaking his hand. And the results? Billions of dollars in deals, new strategic partnerships, and a diplomatic masterstroke that has completely reshaped the global chessboard in a matter of weeks. If you think this is just another day in geopolitics, think again. What is happening right now could define the next decade of world power. Stick around because this story is absolutely wild. Before we dive in, if you are watching this and you have not hit that subscribe button yet, now is the time. We are covering the biggest geopolitical shifts happening in real time, and trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. Smash that like button too. It helps this video reach more people who care about what is really going on in the world. Alright, let us get into it. So here is the situation. In January 2026, the world woke up to what can only be described as diplomatic chaos coming out of Washington. President Trump, fresh off his second inauguration anniversary and still riding high from his controversial military extraction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, doubled down on his obsession with Greenland. And when I say obsession, I am not exaggerating. This man sent a personal text message to Norway's Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre, and in that message he actually wrote that because Norway did not give him the Nobel Peace Prize, he no longer felt an obligation to think purely of peace. Let that sink in for a second. The President of the United States told a foreign leader that a prize snub freed him from peaceful thinking. You cannot make this stuff up. But it gets even more intense. Trump then demanded what he called complete and total control of Greenland. He posted on Truth Social telling NATO to, and I quote, "tell Denmark to get them out of here now," while repeating false claims that Denmark's defense of Greenland consisted of nothing more than 2 dog sleds. That is what the president said about a NATO ally that lost 44 soldiers fighting alongside American troops in Afghanistan. An ally that deployed tens of thousands of troops to support U.S. missions over 2 decades and suffered the 3rd highest per capita casualty rate among coalition forces. Trump claimed the island was surrounded by Russian and Chinese ships, that Denmark could not protect it, and that if the United States did not take it, Russia or China would. Now here is the thing. Multiple analysts, including experts at NATO, have said that the idea of China or Russia conquering Greenland is, and I quote, a myth. One expert put it bluntly, saying the economic bogeyman the Trump administration is putting out there is really quite fictitious. China has no military capability or plan to take over an Arctic island protected by NATO. Russia is already a neighbor of the United States, by the way. The U.S. island of Little Diomede and Russia's Big Diomede in the Bering Strait are only about 2.5 miles apart. But Trump kept pushing. He threatened tariffs of 10% on Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland, with those tariffs set to jump to 25% by June if Denmark did not agree to hand over Greenland. The reaction across Europe was immediate and fierce. Denmark announced a massive military spending increase for Arctic defense. By mid-January 2026, Denmark had committed over 88 billion kroner, that is roughly $13.7 billion to strengthen defense and security in the Arctic. They bought F-35 fighter jets, deployed hundreds of elite Arctic warfare soldiers to Greenland, and made it crystal clear that any invasion would trigger NATO Article 5. The Danish defense minister went on record saying that Danish troops would respond with deadly force to any invasion attempt. Think about that. A NATO ally openly preparing for the possibility of military conflict with the United States over an Arctic island. That is how far things had escalated. And the 8 European countries that were targeted by Trump's tariff threats? They issued a joint statement denouncing the move and reaffirming their commitment to Arctic security. Even politicians from far-right parties across Europe, people who had previously been sympathetic to Trump, were appalled. Nigel Farage called the Greenland threats a very hostile act against Europe. Italy's Giorgia Meloni said the statements were unacceptable and that friendship requires respect. A YouGov poll from February 2026 showed that unfavorable views of the United States had surged across Western Europe. Trump was not just alienating adversaries. He was pushing away his closest friends. Now, at the World Economic Forum in Davos in late January, Trump met with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and announced what he called a framework of a future deal on Greenland. He withdrew the tariff threats on those 8 European nations and ruled out taking Greenland by force. But here is what is interesting. Nobody really knows what that framework actually contains. Trump described it as a pathway toward a long-term deal focused on security and minerals, but the specifics remain a mystery. Greenland's premier and Denmark's prime minister both continued to insist that the island is not for sale. 85% of Greenlanders had already rejected the idea of becoming part of the United States in independent polls. And even some Republican senators and Democratic leaders back in Washington were calling Trump's tariff threats bad for the U.S., bad for business, and a strategic gift to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. That last part is really the key to everything that happened next. Now, here is where the story takes a dramatic turn. Because while Trump was burning bridges with European allies over Greenland, Xi Jinping saw an opportunity. And he seized it with surgical precision. Starting in January 2026, an unprecedented wave of Western leaders began visiting Beijing. We are talking about the prime ministers of Canada, Finland, Ireland, and the United Kingdom, plus the president of Uruguay, and even French President Emmanuel Macron. South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung also made the trip. And Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz was expected to follow in February. As Forbes magazine put it, Beijing was rolling out the red carpet almost daily for foreign dignitaries seeking a less chaotic economic environment. Let me repeat that. A less chaotic economic environment. That is what America's own allies were saying about dealing with China compared to dealing with Washington. The biggest headline came from British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. His visit to China was the first by a UK Prime Minister in 8 years. 8 years. And the reason he went? In his own words, he thought it was a dereliction of duty by previous prime ministers not to go to China. Starmer brought with him a delegation of nearly 60 British business executives and cultural leaders, including representatives from HSBC, British Airways, AstraZeneca, and GSK. This was not a symbolic handshake visit. This was a full-blown economic offensive. And the results were staggering. Over the course of his 3-day visit, the UK and China secured £2.2 billion in export deals, roughly $3 billion. They also locked in £2.3 billion in market access agreements over 5 years. On top of that, hundreds of millions of pounds worth of new Chinese investments were pledged for the UK economy. AstraZeneca alone announced a $15 billion investment in China through 2030 to expand research and development and grow its workforce to over 20,000 employees. Chinese energy storage manufacturer HiTium pledged £200 million to invest in Britain and create 300 new jobs. Chinese automotive manufacturer Chery chose Liverpool as its European headquarters. And Pop Mart, the company behind those viral Labubu toys, confirmed plans to open up to 7 stores across the UK and establish London as its regional hub. But it was not just about money. China agreed to grant British citizens visa-free entry for stays of up to 30 days. They slashed import tariffs on Scotch whiskey from 10% down to 5%, a move expected to generate £250 million in economic value over 5 years. Beijing even lifted travel bans on several British parliamentarians that had been in place since 2021, effectively clearing a major diplomatic roadblock. And both sides agreed to restart bilateral forums covering strategic, economic, financial, and security dialogues throughout 2026. The meeting between Starmer and Xi was supposed to last 40 minutes. It went on for 80 minutes of direct one-on-one conversation between the leaders of 2 of the world's most important economies. And afterward, Starmer took a stroll through the Forbidden City, the ancient imperial palace right in the heart of modern Beijing, surrounded by skyscrapers. Walking through those 600-year-old grounds, Starmer told reporters that strengthening ties with China was in the national interest because of the huge opportunities provided by the world's second-largest economy. He said that is why we have got such a big business delegation. Then she told Starmer that China stands ready to work with Britain in upholding a grand view of history, rising above differences, and promoting mutual respect. He urged further cooperation in areas including education, healthcare, finance, artificial intelligence, bioscience, new energy, and low-carbon technologies. Both sides also agreed to conduct a feasibility study as a first step before negotiating a bilateral services agreement that could establish legally binding rules for British firms operating in China. And keep in mind, British companies already sell about £13 billion in services to China annually. The potential for growth there is enormous. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but what about Trump? What did he have to say about all this? Well, when a reporter asked him about the UK doing business with China, Trump called it very dangerous. He then pivoted to attack Canada, saying it was even more dangerous for them, and that Canada was doing very poorly. The UK's business minister responded by saying Trump was wrong, and that it would be bonkers for the UK not to engage with the world's second-largest economy. That is the word he used. Bonkers. And Canada's story is just as telling. Prime Minister Mark Carney visited Beijing earlier in January, signing multiple cooperation agreements. Canada even agreed to cut tariffs on a limited number of Chinese-made electric vehicles from 100% down to 6.1% in exchange for lower Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola seeds. Carney framed the visit as part of a strategy to build independent, mutually beneficial partnerships rather than relying on unstable powers. Read between the lines there. Unstable powers. He was talking about the United States. Finland's Prime Minister Petteri Orpo also brought a delegation of top business executives to China. After visiting the Forbidden City, he said you do not understand China unless you go to China. The message was clear. Western leaders were seeing for themselves that the narrative about China being nothing but a threat did not match reality on the ground. Now, here is what makes this whole situation so fascinating from a geopolitical standpoint. China did not have to do anything aggressive. It did not have to threaten anyone. It did not have to impose tariffs or send text messages about Nobel Prizes. All China had to do was keep its door open and let Trump do the rest. And that is exactly what happened. Beijing positioned itself as the stable, predictable, multilateral partner in a world where the United States was acting increasingly erratic and unpredictable. China's foreign ministry was masterful in its messaging throughout this entire episode. When Trump claimed Greenland was covered with Chinese ships, spokesperson Lin Jian simply said, and I quote, "We urge the U.S. to stop using the so-called China threat as a pretext to pursue selfish interests." That was it. No screaming. No threats. Just a calm, measured response that made Trump look like the unreasonable one. And spokesperson Guo reinforced the message by stating that international law, based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, is the foundation of the current international order and must be upheld. China was speaking the language of diplomacy, while Trump was speaking the language of a real estate deal gone wrong. And the timing could not have been more strategic. 2026 marks the launch of China's 15th five-year plan, covering development through 2030. She used every single meeting with visiting leaders to brief them on China's future development plans, essentially giving them a preview of the business opportunities that would come from continued engagement. With a population of 1.4 billion people and an economy that accounts for 30% of global economic growth, China was offering something that no Western leader could ignore: stability and market access at a time when their biggest traditional ally was threatening them with tariffs. Then, on February 4th, she held back-to-back diplomatic engagements that showcased China's growing global influence. First, he held a video call with Russian President Vladimir Putin, during which both leaders pledged to strengthen their strategic cooperation amid what they called growing global turbulence. Putin accepted an invitation to visit China in the first half of the year and confirmed he would attend the APEC summit in Shenzhen in November. Just hours later, she got on the phone with Trump himself. Trump called the conversation excellent and praised his personal relationship with Xi. But the readouts from both sides told a very different story. While Trump focused on soybeans and Iran, she was warning the U.S. to handle Taiwan with prudence and reminding Trump that China always means what it says. She even used a Chinese proverb, saying it is always right to do a good thing however small, and always wrong to do a bad thing however small. If that is not a subtle dig at Trump's approach to international relations, I do not know what is. Now, I want to take a step back here and give you the bigger picture, because this is not just about Greenland or trade deals. This is about a fundamental shift in the global order. For decades, the United States has been the center of gravity for Western alliances. NATO, the G7, the World Bank, the IMF, all of these institutions were built around American leadership. But what we are watching right now is something that veteran diplomats are calling unprecedented. America's own allies are actively hedging their bets by deepening ties with China, not because they love Beijing, but because they no longer trust Washington to be a stable partner. A leading Chinese scholar on U.S. politics once compared the U.S.-Europe relationship to a marriage. They may quarrel at the headboard, he said, but they reconcile at the foot of the bed. And that is probably true in the long run. But right now, the quarrel is getting louder, and China is the dinner guest who showed up with flowers, wine, and billions of dollars in investment deals while the couple was fighting. Jack Perry, chairman of the 48 Group, a historic UK-China trade organization, summed it up perfectly. He said, "You do not understand China unless you go to China. So I would say go to China, embrace China, and move forward." And that is exactly what Western leaders are doing. The question now is what happens next. China is hosting APEC in Shenzhen this November, and it is shaping up to be one of the most consequential diplomatic gatherings in years. More Western leaders are expected to visit Beijing in the coming months. Germany's Friedrich Merz, who is expected in February, will likely bring his own business delegation. The EU and India just announced a free trade agreement, and Vietnam upgraded its ties with the EU to a comprehensive strategic partnership. The world is reshaping itself around new alliances and new economic realities, and the United States, under Trump's leadership, seems determined to watch from the sidelines while threatening everyone with tariffs. Meanwhile, in Greenland, the crisis continues. Denmark has deployed hundreds of soldiers and spent billions on Arctic defense. NATO is discussing a permanent mission they're called Arctic Sentry. And 85% of Greenlanders have rejected the idea of becoming part of the United States. The White House estimates that buying Greenland could cost up to $700 billion, with hundreds of billions more needed for infrastructure, mining, and development, and analysts say it could take 10 to 20 years before seeing any notable commercial success. The numbers just do not add up, as one Danish expert put it. So here we are. Trump wants to buy an island that is not for sale, threatening allies who have fought and died alongside American soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping is signing billion-dollar deals with those same allies, offering them stability, market access, and a vision of multilateral cooperation. One leader is burning bridges, the other is building them, and the rest of the world is taking notice. If you found this breakdown valuable, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. It really does make a difference. And if you are not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We break down the biggest geopolitical stories every week, and the way things are going in 2026, there is going to be no shortage of material. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and I will see you in the next one. Stay informed out there.